This is chapter 21, where we're going to be discussing incremental analysis. The emphasis here is on Kroger, recognizing a huge company with many supermarkets, many properties, many things to manage, and recognizing the hundreds of important decisions they make on a daily basis. For example, wholesale produce vendors, which cuts of meats to provide, what to feature each week in the ads. Many of these decisions are short-term in nature and compatible with incremental analysis. That's the focus of this chapter. A subsequent chapter will look at the longer-term consequences, but these are short-term incremental decisions. Now, these short-run decisions are different than the future-oriented, long-run strategic plans, mostly because we don't have time to get information. We've got to make a decision quickly to meet the demands of the market base, and really not much time to get additional information. And so to do so, we want to carefully consider the costs and just consider those costs that are relevant. So here's a set of decisions that need to be made that we think are short-term, might be considered longer terms, but short-term decisions that will need to be considered. For example, when do you special order? When do you decide to do that? What the production constraints are, where to put capacity, which products. Do we make items or do we buy them? Do we make them ourselves or do we outsource it to others? Do we sell, scrap, or rebuild? Let's say we've got some that's damaged and we've got to decide what to do with it, some products, and joint product decisions. So we're going to be working through those. As we do so, we need to consider the relevant information. Where does the information come from? Well, historical, things like financial statements, current costs, current profitability, current sales, and also the future oriented. And then we need to decide what are relevant and which ones are not relevant. So if it's a sunk cost, a decision we've already made that's not going to make a difference in this decision, then it's not relevant for this decision. But opportunity costs, any incremental, marginal revenues or costs, and any out-of-pocket costs would be considered to be relevant. So we'd like to provide an example of this. So Kevin Anderson is a sophomore at the University of Minnesota, and he is trying to decide, should he drive or fly to Miami? So here's a short-term decision. Isn't going to affect his life for the rest of forever, but he decides if he's going to drive, he will leave on Saturday, stay at a roadside motel, and arrive in Miami late Sunday evening. That gives him 5 full days in Miami. However, he would have to leave the following Saturday and spend another Saturday night in a motel on the way back to get there by late Sunday evening. So if he flies, he can leave on Saturday and he can return on Sunday and now have 7 full days. Okay, so let's talk about what is relevant. If he flies, he's going to have to pay a dog sitter for 7 days. But if he drives, he also has to pay a dog sitter for 7 days. How much is the airfare and taxis versus the gas that would be spent? How many days in Miami? How many nights in motels? And how many days of eating? Okay, so which of these are relevant? Well, these look the same in both cases. This is different but may not affect costs. Either way, we're going to have to pay for a hotel or motel. Either way, we're going to have to eat for 8 days. So we have to figure out what is relevant. So let's help Kevin analyze this information. If he decides to stay in Florida, he must stay for a total of 8 days. If he decides to fly, he also must stay 8 days. So if we assume that the cost for room in Miami does not differ significantly, and this might be a relevant question, but for now, let's assume that the motel charges are not relevant because they don't differ among the alternatives. The same logic applies to dog sitting. Hey, either way, it's going to be 8 or 9 days. 9 days, 8 nights. Thus, the dog will require the same amount of care, and it would be the same. Therefore, the costs associated with dog sitting and meals are not relevant in deciding between driving and flying. So how about the $800 Kevin spent for car insurance? Well, this cost has already been incurred. You're going to pay for it whether the car sits there or it does not. And this would be an example of a sunk cost. We made that decision long ago, not relevant in this decision. So sometimes it's important to differentiate between these two. In financial terms, Kevin's decision can be made by comparing the $300 he would spend on gasoline to the $500 he would spend on a round-trip airline ticket. So he might be tempted to drive and save that $200. Hey, this is a cost class. We're accountants. We're looking and we're trying to say, okay, that makes sense. But there's a lot of other things to consider. Non-financial factors that might be as or more important. For example, he would get 2 more days on the beach. He might be exhausted from driving. Hey, the car has that much more wear and tear driving from Minnesota all the way to Miami. Hey, what happens if his car breaks down? Okay, which mode of transportation is the safest? And so really looking at those as also important to the decision. When we think about this, we're thinking about all of the information that is needed to make a particular business decision, and relevance is particularly important. The whole process requires an understanding of both the quantitative, the numbers, as well as qualitative, which for now I think about as non-financial information, some legal issues, what's ethical, what's not, and an ability to discern fact from opinion. Okay, so all of these are important. So let's assume that Red Star Ketchup is closed for a labor strike. During the strike, Red Star is incurring costs of approximately $15,000 per week for utilities, interest, and salaries of the non-striking employees. A major film company has offered to rent the ketchup factory for a week at a price of $10,000. Okay, if the factory is rented, Red Star's management estimates that its cleanup costs will amount to nearly $2,000. Solely on the basis of this information, would it be profitable or not for the company to rent the ketchup factory to the film company? If the factory is rented, Red Star profitability for the week may be measured as follows. They're going to get $10,000, but the costs are the weekly factory costs of $15,000. That's how much it costs. And the cleanup cost of $2,000. All right. Does the anticipated operating loss of $7,000 mean that Red Star should refuse the film company's offer? All right. Let's figure out which ones of these costs are relevant for this decision. So the $15,000 in weekly factory expenses continues whether or not we rent it out. And so the relevant factors do not include that. And so if we look at this kind of reject offer, hey, we have that $15,000. Accept offer, still has that $15,000 either way. But if we're doing incremental analysis, we say, hey, we're going to get $10,000 and it will cost us $2,000. So an increase or reduction in operating loss of $8,000. So there might be other things to consider, but at least on a basis of cost, it makes sense to go ahead and rent it. Let's talk for a minute about opportunity cost. Let's assume that you pass up a summer job that pays $4,000 and instead decide to attend summer school. The $4,000 may be viewed as an opportunity cost of attending summer school. These opportunity costs represent the benefit that could have been obtained by pursuing an alternate course of action. So you have one versus the other. All right, so these are important things to consider. Like other things to consider is, hey, if you attend summer school, even though it's going to cost you $4,000, maybe you're making progress toward a degree. So these are things to consider. The next one is sunk cost versus out of pocket. Sunk cost has already been decided. So that insurance for Kevin's case, the $800 insurance, either way, you've already made that decision. And that's not going to be affected by your trip to Miami. And out of pocket costs describe a cost that has not yet been incurred and may vary among the possible courses of action. So we need to determine the most relevant costs that need to be considered. Okay? All right. So assume that Par 4 manufactures golf balls and it distributes them in the U.S. While the company has the capacity in manufacturing 2 million balls per month, its current sales require that only 800,000 units be produced. At this level of output, monthly manufacturing costs average $480,000 or 60 cents per ball. Okay, so that's where we sit now. We could produce 2 million, but hey, our current sales is 800,000, 20 cents per ball. Okay. All right. So let's assume that Par 4 receives a special order from NGC, a company that sells golf products in Japan, for 500,000 special label golf balls. The balls would be imprinted with the NGC name and logo, and it would not be any way identified with Par 4. To avoid direct competition with Par 4's regular customers, NGC has agreed not to sell these balls outside of Japan, so it probably wouldn't affect their current sales level in the US. However, it is willing to pay Par 4 only $250,000 per month for the special order, and that's only 50 cents per ball. But before, it made 60 cents. So would it be profitable to accept the order? At first glance, the order appears to be unprofitable. Hey, their offer is 50 cents. We usually sell it for $1.25 and is less than Par 4's 60 cents per manufacturing cost. However, before we decide, let's perform an incremental analysis and just look at the costs and revenues relevant to this decision. So, production level now, that's what we're making now, 520. The production level with 1.3 million balls. And so we're going to have a special order. We're going to make an additional 250. It's going to cost us 20 cents per ball. So that incremental cost is 100,000. Okay. Fixed manufacturing costs are the same. We had capacity for 2 million, so no problem there. So by accepting this offer, we're going to make an additional 150,000. So we're going to include the relevant costs and benefits. Only additional cost of 20 cents per unit is relevant because the fixed costs don't change either way. And so we're going to make an additional 30 cents per unit. That's the 50 cents they're paying us less the 20 cents per unit of the variable costs. And so you can see that makes sense. So assume you're a sales representative for Par 4, one of your best customer clubs and caddies has heard about the special order shipment. Clubs and caddies has been paying 80 cents per ball and would like the same special order. In fact, the purchasing manager at Clubs and Caddies says it is unethical for you to not to sell at the same price per ball that you are charging NGC. Well, I wouldn't say it's unethical, but if they hear about it, they're probably going to complain. And so you might ask Club and Caddies to consider their options and determine if this makes sense to pay 80 cents versus an alternative from someone else. And so while we don't need to offer the same price necessarily, these factors are things we need to consider and determine if that affects our decision. All right. Now assume that Fran's studio creates 3 products: watercolors, oil paintings, and custom frames. Total output is limited to what can be produced in 6,000 hours of direct labor. Contribution margin per direct labor hour required to complete each of the studio's products is as follows. And so you can see based on the contribution margin and the number of direct labor hours required, this would be the contribution margin per hour. But we're limited to 6,000 hours. So the question is, how do we proceed? Notice that oil paints generates the highest contribution margin per unit. That's this $100. But it requires 4 hours of direct labor hours. Okay. All right. Watercolors are the studio's most profitable product in terms of contribution margin per hour. We saw that here. That's that $30. The contribution margin per direct labor hour is this. In general, when capacity is constrained by the limited availability of a particular input, a company should attempt to maximize its contribution margin per unit of that input. So, if we did all 6,000 hours on watercolors, we'd make a contribution margin of 180,000, or oil paintings or custom frames. And so we can see that there. All right. So all other things equal, if we could sell enough of them, and if it were stable, we'd go with watercolors. So in most cases, however, a company cannot simply manufacture the single product that is most profitable. For example, the demand for watercolors may not be sufficient to allow them to only sell watercolors. In this case, operating income will be maximized by creating oil paintings once the demand for watercolors is satisfied. Okay, so if we go back here a couple slides and we see, hey, first let's produce all we can of the watercolors, Then let's go to the oil paintings because it has the next highest contribution margin per direct labor hour. Okay, so we see that. Assume that you're the store manager and you would like to expand by selling posters and prints in addition to watercolors and oil paintings. Do you think the posters and prints are complementary? Okay, they may or may not be. They may say, hey, when we make watercolors and oil paintings and they're in the store already, maybe they're going to sell posters and prints. The problem is we don't have enough capacity. And so would we extend that capacity? So lots of things to consider here. The next incremental decision is make or buy decisions. In many manufacturing operations, a company can just produce it themselves or buy it from an outside supplier. If the company is currently producing a part that could be purchased at a lower cost from outsiders, perhaps profits can be increased and use the company's own manufacturing resources for possibly higher margin products or other products. So if a company can buy for $5 per unit a part that costs the company $6 to produce, the choice seems to be clearly in favor of buying. Okay, so we can buy it for $5, costs us $6. But the astute reader will quickly raise the question, what is included in the cost of $6 per unit? Assume that the $6 unit cost of producing a normal required volume of 10,000 units per month is determined this way. So here's the direct materials, direct labor, factory overhead. But that fixed overhead is a big component of that $6. So let's do an incremental analysis. So after reviewing this information, we determined that if the production of this part were discontinued, all the costs of direct materials and direct costs plus 9,000 of the variable overhead, so notice here's the 9,000, would be eliminated. These then are the relevant costs in producing the 10,000 units of the component part. So we're able to compare the make the part and buy the part and see which one makes us better off. Okay, our analysis shows that making the part will cost $60,000 per month, while buying the part will cost $78,000 per month. And so we can see that thus the company will save $18,000 per month by continuing to make the part. There are also a number of other factors, like if we buy it, will the product quality be sufficient? Will it be there when we need it? Do we have a good relationship? A lot of non-financial. And so all of these incremental decisions really have a non-financial or a qualitative component that should be considered. Okay, so now let's go to another incremental decision, the sell, scrap, or rebuild decision. All right, so let's work through this one. Assume that Computex has in its inventory 500 laptop computers that cost $325,000 to produce. Unfortunately, their processors are now technologically obsolete. Consequently, management must decide what to do with these machines. It's got three options. Sell the laptop as is to the network for $250,000. All right, even though it costs us $325,000, we can get $250,000 out of it. Sell them for $235,000 to surrounding school districts. Okay, that's another decision. Scrap the existing processor in each machine and replace it with faster state-of-the-art equipment at a cost of $190,000. If we do that, then the rebuilt laptops can be sold for $450,000. So let's compare the incremental revenues and the incremental costs in all these decisions. Okay, notice that the $325,000 has already been spent. So it's just, we've already spent that. That's the sunk cost. But the relevant ones are sell it to TSN, sell to schools, or if we incur incremental costs, we can now sell it for $450,000. All of the things equal, hey, we're not going to recover these $325,000, but if we rebuild, we're going to have the highest level of incremental income. So no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to recover that money. And it appears that rebuilding the computers will be the most profitable course of action. However, as always, there's always some non-financial implications. So if rebuilding these laptops interferes with the production of other products, hey, we're continuing to produce. Hey, that might mean we can make less products. And so maybe we should just sell it to TSN. Okay. There also might be a long-term advantage in selling laptops to schools. And these students and parents may ultimately become customers of other Computex products. So you can see how that might affect the decision. The next incremental analysis question we're going to consider is joint product decisions. So many companies produce multiple products from common raw materials and have a shared production process. Examples include oil refineries, lumber and steel mills, and meat processing companies. For example, lumber and steel mill, they're going to produce boards, wood that they could sell at Lowe's or somewhere else, but they might also get something out of the shavings or the pieces that might come off of the wood. And so we're going to call these things joint products. And so the manufacturing costs that relate to these are called joint costs. And so to make these decisions, there are two issues: how to allocate joint costs among the various types of products manufactured, and whether some types of products should be processed further to create an even more valuable finished good. Okay, so this is a joint product decision. Now let's consider joint costs. Assume that Char-Cor mixes together wood chips and pine oil. After joint manufacturing costs of $2,000 have been incurred, this mixture separates into two sellable products: granulated charcoal and methyl alcohol. How should the $2,000 in joint costs be allocated between these products? Well, there's no right way to allocate joint costs, but the most common way is in proportion to the relative sales volume. Okay, so this is one of those where there's not definitive rules, not like financial accounting. These are ones where we need to decide what works best, but usually the most common method is in proportion to the sales value. So let's look at this. There's two products, right? Charcoal and alcohol. Charcoal produced by Char-Cor's $2,000 in joint manufacturing costs has a sales value of $5,000, and the alcohol has a sales value of $9,000 for a combined value of $14,000. So how do we allocate these $2,000? Well, according to relative sales value. So $5,000 of the $14,000 value, that percentage would be applied to charcoal, and alcohol's percentage would be applied to alcohol. And so you could see how those costs are allocated. Now, we have another decision, which we call a split-off point. Once the joint products can be separated, they have reached what is called the split-off point. At this point, each product can be maybe sold independently or processed further. So charcoal is going to may sell the charcoal and the alcohol after the split-off point. Okay, or it may continue processing either of these products. Arguably, if they can process further, it might create more value. So let's see when and how it makes sense. So here's the decision, right? They're going to combine pine oil with wood chips. They're going to have a mixing process, and they're going to decide, how and when to sell these. So these products are separated, and we decided methyl alcohol, it has a value of $9,000. And granulated charcoal has a value of $5,000. So we could stop there or continue. If we continue, then the incremental cost to go from methyl alcohol to cleaning solvent is now $14,000, but we incurred additional costs of $7,000. Okay, this granulated charcoal could turn into air filters at an incremental cost of $6,000. So we have some decisions to make. So let's look at these. All right, first of all, notice here's the charcoal portion. Here is the alcohol portion. So revenue if charcoal is used to make air filters is $15,000. But the revenue if charcoal is sold at the split-off point is $5,000. So incremental revenue is $10,000. It costs us $6,000 to produce. Okay, so the net increase in operating income is $4,000. The amount of revenue if alcohol is used and makes cleaning solvent would be $14,000. But at split off point, it's worth $9,000. So the incremental revenue is $5,000, but the incremental cost is $7,000. And so we would actually lose $2,000. So you can see the different decisions that we make. It looks like we would process further the charcoal, but not process further the alcohol. Okay, so these are all looking at the various sources of information. what is relevant, what is not relevant, what are the relevant financial, the relevant non-financial, things like legal issues and ethical issues, all to make these various types of incremental decisions.